All right, you guys, hi. Welcome to day one of NCHB's virtual conference. We're excited to have you guys. Today's session is on eviction prevention, and we have some great information, two great speakers for y'all. Just a couple of quick things before we jump into the presentations. You guys are all on mute, everybody who's in attendance today. The only way you can communicate with us is through the control panel. It should have popped up to the right of your screen. And you can use the questions box there to kind of introduce yourself. If you have questions, comments throughout the presentation, use that same box. We will be saving about 15 minutes at the very end to do a Q&A session. So if you have any thoughts, you know, anything that comes up throughout the presentation, please use that box to send in your feedback. If you guys are in attendance today or if you registered, you will receive a recording and the slides from today. We are doing a daily recap every morning, which will cover everything we talked about in the previous day's sessions. So you will receive recordings that way and slides from today that way. I believe that's everything. Before we get started today, we're going to do a quick poll just to gauge kind of who's in the audience. I'll let David go ahead and get the poll going for us. And just thank you to everybody who's in attendance and also to our speakers. So you guys should see your screen just switched over to a question. We just want to know who is in the audience today. This we'll use to guide some discussion at the end in the Q&A session. So please go ahead, start filling out the poll. It should just be pretty straightforward. What is your role? And we will use this to guide discussion at the end. We'll leave it up for a couple more seconds. All right, looks like people are participating, so that's great. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, you guys. So yeah, thank you again for being here today. I'm gonna go ahead and let the speakers introduce themselves and we'll jump into our presentations.
David, please go ahead. Can't hear you, David. Oh.
All right, there we go. Sorry about that. And I just wanted to say one thing about the poll before I did introductions. If we left off a category, let us know in the chat box. I saw that was an edit, an error on my part. Sort of, we just wanted to really see sort of who was in the audience. Not sure if we're able to get the information from that poll. So yeah, if we are able to see that, Jasmine, just please add that. But without further delay, I am David Dirks. I'm an attorney based out of Maryland. And I would like to also introduce sort of our first speaker that's sort of going to take one portion of this presentation, Mr. James W. Heaton. And he is an attorney with the supervising attorney with the Legal Aid Service of Broward County in Florida. So we have some East Coast attorneys here with you all. We're going to try to give sort of a national perspective on eviction and make it as applicable to all of the work that you all are doing as it relates to ensuring that clients or veterans or anyone that's experiencing homelessness can remain in their house and not get evicted. I'll speak more so from a pro bono attorney's perspective, as I've been working in Baltimore and in Prince George's County in Maryland doing eviction and rent cases over the last year, especially during as things started to ramp up as courts opened back up. So without further ado, I'll just turn it over to James so that he can take it over, and we'll probably, you know, piggyback off of each other a lot through this presentation. Please chat with us, ask any questions that you may have. We'll try our best to answer them. And also, just please remember, got to put this caveat and disclaimer out there. All of the information that we're giving you here today is not, should not be used as legal advice. So if we have any, consumers or any individuals or families that are currently, attending this session, please note that this is not intended to be legal advice, but more so for information and knowledge purposes. So definitely want to put that out there first and turn it over to James. James, take it over.
Thank you, David, and definitely appreciate that. And a little bit more on that, this not being legal advice thing that you hear from all the attorneys that do all the presentations that you've ever watched. We will be talking about resources and how to find and engage with attorneys across the country and in your local areas as well. So thank you, David, for the introduction. Just a quick little background on myself as well and the program that I have here at Legal Aid Service of Broward County. So it's a pretty unique project where we have some private funding dollars. So we don't have any Legal Services Corporation or LSC restricted funding, and it allows us to do a whole lot of civil legal services for veterans and their families. And we also work with 2 supportive services for veteran families programs here locally in Broward County to address the needs of veterans who are experiencing homelessness or at the risk of experiencing homelessness. So great little project here. And I realized a few years ago that I live in a bit of a bubble here in South Florida, and that not everywhere across the country has a robust connection of legal services into their homeless community continuum of care. So it's definitely something that I'm very passionate about, and I know David is as well, as he provides pro bono services on this end. So we're very happy to talk to you today about these issues, and we're going to get started. So first slide, please. Now, when we talk about preventing homelessness, and as our first slide begins to load,
yeah, and bear with us just for a minute, folks. I think there's a slight lag in when the presentation goes forward. Let me make sure I'm not responsible for that. I think David. Really quickly, while we're waiting on that, it seems like we had about 76% of those of you who completed the poll are a provider in some capacity. 17% are federal employees, and 6% are funders. So that's really good to know, because I think as we talk about this, some things may be applicable and some things may not be. And I will, during my part of the presentation, I'll be sure to talk about that. Obviously, sometimes federal employees are not able to advocate for certain things, but I think that's a part of this discussion as well.
Thank you for that. And looks like we're back on track with the PowerPoint as well. So here's, when we talk about preventing evictions, it's important to understand and to realize the history of what has been the reality in this country for eviction prevention for the past 15 months at this point. Geez, I can't believe I'm saying that now. I feel like every month I'm like 16 months. It's always adding on. But for the past 15 months so far, moratorium or moratoria have been really the staple and the backbone of eviction prevention across the country. If you ever go to a cocktail party, which you probably haven't done in the past 15 months, and you mentioned that you're in the eviction defense or in the homelessness realm, the first question many people ask you are, well, what about the moratorium? What's going on with that? So I want to provide a quick and brief history of the moratorium, and we'll talk about that. And then also, what did the moratoria do? How were renters protected? And then I'm going to kind of round everything out in my presentation with some data behind the eviction stall. We'll also talk about resources as well, and some of the other expectations post moratorium. So next slide, please. So when we talk about this, the moratorium, it's essentially broken up into 3 different periods throughout history, if you will. So the first one being, as we all recall, back on that fateful day in March of 2020, feels like it was 10 years ago. It might feel like it was 5 minutes ago for some of you, when the CARES Act was signed into law. And that was enacted on March 27, 2020. And the purpose of the CARES Act, at least for the presentation that we're having today, was it implemented essentially language that halted residential evictions for tenants residing in what they called covered dwellings. And at the time, those covered dwellings included properties that received federal funding, very loosely speaking. That was broadly to include private homeowners who had mortgages by Freddie Mae or Fannie Mac as well, not just HUD or Section 8 houses, or more of the traditionally federally funded programs and community homes as well. So it was very broadly covering many individuals across the country. One of the things we'll talk about in a moment as well is a lot of the suffering that I'm sure many of you did, and I know we did as legal service providers, with when was the CARES Act going to end? We thought it was going to be April, and then maybe it was going to be May, and then June, and then ultimately, rest in peace, CARES Act, July 24th, 2020. Though the specter of the CARES Act still lurks over us, when there's that 30-day notice requirement for certain programs, but just know the CARES Act officially or effectively ended July 24th, 2020. So what happened after the CARES Act? Fortunately, at the time, nearly every state had some form of eviction protection or moratorium in place. I'll tell you, the state of Florida here was very, I don't want to call them very quick to react, but they did react in an appropriate amount of time. So that on July 25th, 2020, when the CARES Act ended, there was some protection to homeowners here. Now, the problem is, and I'm sure many of you can relate to this, that in our state here in Florida, the state moratorium was unfortunately vaguely worded and allowed for some sort of evictions to actually start getting refiled. So it only prevented evictions from being finalized, as the moratorium stated. Though, if you talk to advocates here, when is an eviction finalized? I would argue it's, it could be construed as when the tenant is actually removed from the home from the local sheriff's office, when the writ of possession is executed. So it didn't really provide a lot of clarity. So we would always argue, oh no, it's essentially that it can't be filed, but at that point it's already been filed. So we had some issues. But just so you know, these state and local moratoria filled the gap between the CARES Act and what we have today as a stopgap, which is the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and their moratorium. So that was signed on September 1st, 2020, and enacted on September 4th. And as I mentioned, it really works as this sort of stopgap for when there are no local or state protections in place. Now, when is that going to go away? I don't know. Is it going to be next week? Who knows? This is one of the things that we get to enjoy doing as service providers, is collectively freak out every time the eviction moratorium expiration date starts coming really close. One of the things to add about the CDC protection or CDC moratorium is that there's been a lot of federal litigation about whether it is whether the CDC actually has the power under the Constitution to enforce or to implement such a moratorium without that power being expressly given by Congress. Well, they had an opportunity in January to redo it. Instead, they just extended the moratorium, which is, I'm guessing, would happen again at the end of June if they so deem appropriate. So we're all kind of collectively and figuratively and maybe actually sitting at the edge of our seats waiting for something to come down, some news to come down from the executive branch about the fate of the CDC moratorium. But just so you know, that CDC moratorium, the way it's in place right now, it protects covered individuals. So no longer covered dwellings, as the CARES Act said. These are protected and covered individuals. And essentially, without getting into too much of the muck about the CDC, the moratorium is actually pretty easy read if you want to take a look at it, if you haven't already, which I'm guessing many of you are learned experts on it to find out who it covers, but essentially has a declaration involved with it. Maybe you live in a state that doesn't have to deal with the CDC and you have your own wonderful protections. Well, congratulations. I feel good for you and the people that live in your state as well. But let's move on to this next slide and kind of talk about the effects of the moratorium and collectively moratoria. So under the law, some of these big picture effects. So one of the things that the moratoria allowed to happen was the direction and reutilization of both federal and state dollars to move into local resources to help really this eviction prevention measure. So that meant money coming into municipalities, money coming into cities to help literally put these dollars into the landlord's pockets to prevent evictions, to help individuals relocate if they were unable to continue to reside in the home that they were renting or unable to afford, or maybe they had been evicted or removed, or maybe they left because they didn't know that they had these protections, which is unfortunately a very big issue. The dollars also worked, and I'll give you an example of Florida stuff kind of intertwined throughout this whole presentation. But here in South Florida and throughout the state, some of the CARES Act dollars and some of the other federal dollars came in here and allowed us to kind of reform how the court systems worked in Florida. So Florida has a very landlord-friendly eviction process. Tenants don't really have a whole lot of rights. And in fact, tenants have no rights to defenses unless they post the amount of rent that's in question during an eviction. Yep, one of two states, us in Arkansas.
Wow.
I tell my friends in Arkansas, but yep. So one of the things that we were able to negotiate, at least in our circuit here, was why don't we throw in a mediation process in between that? Weird, right? Weird that we have to have a pandemic to start getting people's due process rights addressed, but that's what had to happen here. And fortunately, we were able to use some of those CARES Act and other federal dollars to work out a mediation system, which has been, working pretty well. Well, when you don't really have anything in place, every little bit helps. One of the other things under laws, it established standards for preventing and delaying evictions to the courts. So the CARES Act, I think if it did nothing, which it did a lot, if it did nothing, it really helped provide the framework to show, hey, this is needed, and help encourage the states and localities to say, okay, well, we also need to put forth some sort of prevention or moratorium to prevent this wave of evictions that are going to happen. Also, it provided additional protections to renters from prohibited practices of landlords. Again, in Florida, we don't have a whole lot of protections for landlords. There's no rent control here. There's no right to counsel for evictions. There's, as I mentioned, very little in the way of required defenses as far as evictions go. So the CARES Act really provides these additional protections, and the CDC order provides even more protections from prohibited practices of landlords in the form of both civil fines and punitive fines as well. So we'll see how that all pans out in the future, if those are ever enforced or pursued.
Stick around.
Yeah, stick around. It's going to be an exciting rest of the year. But we really just, as I mentioned, it's just provided a whole mess of framework for how things should be done, or at least an example of how things should be done. Florida now, or across the country now. Conceptually, these moratorium really have prevented the spread of COVID-19, and we'll talk about some data on that in just a moment. It prevented mass homelessness through eviction. Imagine if there were no moratorium in your area, how when you're working with these individuals, I'm sure the moratorium have allowed you to buy time to rehouse people, buy time to find resources, buy time to figure out and work out deals with the landlords. Imagine if that stopgap wasn't in place, the potential mass homelessness that could have happened. It's also allowed tenants an opportunity to regain control of their lives and empower themselves. So imagine you lost your job in March and April and May, you're still looking for employment, and you're trying to take care of your family and prevent mass spread of this new pandemic. You don't know what's going on in 2020. And maybe in in August, you started finding employment again. Well, now you're 5 months behind on your rent. And you're like, how am I ever gonna regain control over my financial life after being 5 months behind on my rent? I just started a job. Maybe my spouse isn't working. There's all these other issues. Well, these moratorium have really allowed people to regain control over their lives as well. And the last thing conceptually it did was it scared the hell out of service providers due to the uncertainty of the expirations. And as I mentioned, it is ongoing, this issue. It's continuing to scare us. I don't know about David, but I lose sleep over this stuff constantly.
Going to court, it is very scary because we don't know what judges are going to do. We don't know how long these protections are going to last, and it's a gamble. If you get if you have to come to court later to get a postponement, you don't know if that's going to be in effect, which we'll talk about sort of the difference between what it's doing. People can still sue, however, they're not going to get possession of the property because the sheriff, even if a judge did do it, a sheriff most likely is not going to follow through on a writ for possession, or I'm not sure what it's called in Florida. They're not going to go through with it because it would be essentially against the law. It's I don't know. I'm highly nervous, and I think that there's going to be a high need for a lot of legal aid attorneys and pro bono attorneys because there's just not enough, as we all know. There's not enough of anything to go around for people with lower incomes, and it's really a sad situation that we're in.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that 100%. And I'm sure you guys as providers out there, being the majority of this group, feel the question daily of when does this moratorium end? How long is this protection going to last? What's going to happen after the moratorium expires? I haven't caught up on my rent yet. Hey, you all moved me into this place in October, and I haven't had to pay my rent, or I haven't been able to pay my rent in the past couple months. What am I going to do? What's next? How am I going to not be homeless? Well, these are all questions that we get as well as legal service providers from clients who are saying, well, how long are these protections going to last? And our answer is, we don't know at this point. We have no idea, especially as the world begins, or our country at least begins to reopen. And it seems like we're on the tail end of the pandemic, at least again here in the United States. We don't know what's going to happen. So there's a lot of uncertainty with these protections. And we talk about the moratorium because it has been the backbone again of the protections for tenants. Dollars are helpful. It's very helpful to rehouse people. But, as many of you know, there's a lot of uncertainty with people's jobs, with their unemployment benefits, with their ability to be sustainable in housing. I know down here we have a huge affordable housing crisis, which I'm sure all of you across the state or across the country have as well in your communities. Broward County and Miami-Dade County and Palm Beach County are notorious for increasing rent amounts where anecdotally you can't get a one-bedroom apartment for under $1,200 in Broward County, unless you're going to have a host of issues: mold, rodents, roaches, things not working, issues with services and utilities and all these problems that come with it. It's very, very difficult. All right, next slide, please. So this slide is for what you all came for, a slide of data. Who doesn't love data, right? If you're not sleeping already from my monotone voice about the moratorium, just wait now when we talk about data. So I want to talk about kind of two different aspects that I found very interesting. So the first was coming from a medical perspective, where I pulled all this data from the National Library of Medicine, and when they talked about what they saw from a few studies about how these moratorium played into stopping the spread of COVID-19. So when we talk about pre-pandemic and historically, 1/3 of evicted tenants would move in with other families. So 1/3 of people evicted from their homes would move in, doubling up on space, sleeping on couches, normally the stuff that that wouldn't be that big of a deal. Having a family member come in and stay in a spare bedroom or on a couch or on a mattress or in a pull-out bed or on the floor or whatever it might be. That was 1/3 of evicted tenants would move in with family. Another third would end up unsheltered. So these are folks that would spend, a night of homelessness. The folks that would be, technically homeless under McKinney-Vento, and obviously the SSVF parameters and HUD-VASH parameters. These folks, about 1/3 would go unsheltered. So when we talk about a large percentage of folks that after eviction would almost literally have nowhere to go or not have a stable place to go if they would have not have a stable place to go that wouldn't expose them directly to the COVID-19 virus. You're looking at 2/3 of people historically who are getting evicted who are going out into either the population on the streets and spending a night in their car, whatever it might be, or having to double up with family and potentially spread the risks. So there was a study from the medical school at Duke that showed that these moratorium reduced the transmission of COVID by 4% and reduced COVID deaths by 11% by providing individuals with the ability to stay in their homes and stay where they are, stay around their systems if necessary, but also be able to, not, be having to commingle with a bunch of other people in shelters or being unsheltered on the streets or having to double up with family members. Reduce transmission rates by 4%, which is quite interesting to think about. And also, one of the things it did was provide a level of security. So lower rates of food insecurity, lower rates of mental health stress, which essentially equated to a higher rate of well-being. So you have these numbers of these conceptual ideas from the healthcare side of this is what we think the moratorium did for healthy people. But when you started thinking about it, imagine the other end of it being a higher stress rates, mass evictions, mass homelessness, what that could do to the long-term psyche of people having to go through that trauma. Now, the GAO office, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, their report showed that this year, since compared to 2019, there are 36% fewer evictions. Let me rephrase that. From 2019, let me go to the last statistic first, as my notes on here show. Filings were down 50% from 2019 on evictions, though it doesn't mean that still hundreds of thousands of evictions were still filed. There were still a lot of evictions filed since courts reopened, and that is different for everyone across the country. I'll tell you here, when they started allowing refiling in October of 2020, evictions were filed very quickly, and without much stopping it. We started getting very busy again on that front of having to file things with court, call landlords, and do all the things that we were doing pre-eviction.
And it's fairly easy, James. I just want to add, it's fairly easy too, or at least in Maryland, it's a paper form that all at landlords. So even if it's a lay person, someone who's not an attorney that's representing a landlord, or someone who's renting out a house, or they may have a small apartment building, it's pretty much you go to the court, fill the paperwork out, put in how much is owed, and that's pretty much the complaint in and of itself. And you just have to make sure that you serve it on the tenant, which I'm not going to get into all of those details, but it's not a hard process to start an eviction proceeding. It's fairly easy.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, as I mentioned, with Florida being a very landlord-friendly state when it comes to evictions, it is exceedingly easy here to file an eviction. And as David mentioned, you don't have to engage an attorney to do it. Many landlords, there's some circumstances where they're not allowed to, but many landlords are readily able to just file an eviction by going down to the courthouse and doing what they always had done. Now, one of the things that the GAO report did show is that in states that had only CDC protection, so no local or state moratorium, 36% fewer evictions as compared to 2019. So evictions and these are our filings again. Eviction filings were generally down in those places, but 91% fewer filings in states that had their own protections, that they didn't have to rely on the CDC. So it shows that a lot of these states and a lot of these municipalities and localities really cared more about their individual citizens and residents than maybe the CDC did, which is fine. The CDC provided some great protections, but the data does show, and I'm sure that there's other things that you can imagine and think about that could really that could show why there's why the data is that way. But the data does show that in the CDC protected places, evictions, there were fewer evictions, but they weren't as protected as when a state or a municipality were able to create their own moratorium. So, all right. So next slide, please. Now, what can we expect post-moratoria? I wish I had a picture of Mad Max on here, because I like to have that conceptual, that picture painted in my head of just people riding around in a dust bowl and all this industrial get up screaming out of their Jeeps, which is Miami on a regular day. But the post-moratorium, I really have no idea. That's the crazy thing, is we don't really know what to expect. But one of the things that we're really hopeful of, and I've talked to some of the folks at SSVF and the higher ups at SSVF, which they've assured me that a lot of these services and a lot of the additions that have been provided to SSVF to address the eviction crisis are going to continue post-moratorium. And even once folks start getting back into the swing of things and becoming reemployed, they're really going to be focusing on addressing those needs. Now, I keep my fingers crossed and I pray at night to every God available that these things are going to actually stay in place as we've been told, and we're very hopeful that they will be. But once there's no moratorium in place, once there's no federal protection, it's going to be up to the states. If there's no state protection, it's going to be up to us, you, me, all of us, all of our colleagues, everyone we work with, to really do what we can to prevent these evictions. And I believe David's going to be talking about some upstream things as well that can be done in the future. But it's really going to be going back to the things that we used to do and learning from the things that we have experienced over the past 15 months. Hopefully we've been able to forge some good relationships with these landlords. They're going through some hardships as well, understandably so. So it's, hopefully we've been able to do that, and that there's not just going to be a moratorium cliff where everyone falls off of once all of these protections start expiring. Now, the expirations, these things can start expiring as the CDC may expire at the end of next week, or middle of next week on June 30th. So we're waiting with bated breath to hear more from the executive branch about an extension there. And but we just don't know. And I don't want to be the person who runs around screaming, that the sky's falling, but this is the reality, and this is what we've been doing since effectively May of 2020. So it's tough to really know.
Absolutely. And I know, there's many of our partners, like NAEH, NCHV, legal aid societies, tenant rights organizations. I mean, this is a big advocacy sort of push right now. And I know that certain states, and I'll talk about Maryland a little bit later, but you're absolutely right. I think, James, you hit the nail on the head. If some of these protections are not extended through executive action or either from governors, it behooves us to, do what we need to do and what we can do within our powers to try to make noise enough, because, it really is. I'll talk about sort of some other stuff later, but it's a horrible process for a lot of people. And it's as we talk about cycles of poverty, cycles of trauma, bringing somebody into court that's not tenant friendly, is outside of them losing their housing. That whole process is just pretty horrible for a lot of people. But I'll stop there.
No, it really is. It's been tough enough with all the trauma that people have been experiencing during the pandemic, and these protections, I'm sure, have been relieving some burden of, or maybe not some burden of the trauma that they're experiencing, but not adding additional stressors to their lives. That's it's going to be, unfortunately, we're just don't know what's going to happen, but it may be bad, it may be okay. I don't know. We're going to hope for the okay. Now let's go to the next slide so we can talk about how hopeful we are. So let's talk about the hopeful future of evictions. Yeah, let's get positive takeaways from the COVID-19 pandemic. This slide's empty for a reason. No, I'm just kidding. There have been a lot of positive to come out of the pandemic. And when I say that, it's things that we've learned, things, systems that are now in place that we're hopeful are going to continue to stay in place. The community coming together in certain aspects. I hope many people here, or at least one person here, has experienced a new relationship that they've made in their community, that they've added to their homeless continuum of care because it was a necessity out of the pandemic. I hope someone in this group realized that, hey, we're able to pull in case managers from different states, from different parts of the state. Maybe you're in a rural area and you realize, oh, we're able to now effectively assist that rural area because of Zoom, because of remote technology. Just maybe we can now just go drop a computer off at a resource center, or have one or two individuals as human capital working in those areas, but then have access to hundreds of other people, or dozens of other people who are able to provide services as well because of remote working. I can tell you here, one of our community partners, Operation Sacred Trust, has always been an in-person spot. They work closely with the local VA, and they've always been one of these hubs that veterans would come and hang out pre-pandemic. You'd go in there on any given day, and there'd be a dozen or so men and women who former military status veterans hanging out there, playing video games, shooting the shit, eating pizza, getting services, or being right there with services. Well, that stopped during the pandemic. One of the things that didn't stop was growing their network of case managers. They've always had a lot of well-trained and developed case managers, and now they still do, but some of them work in or live out of the state. They now have case managers living in and around the DC area. David, you might have run into a few of them at the grocery store, who knows? But they're able to pull case managers from outside of the state and have them effectively work that way remotely. So it's been very helpful as well. I'll tell you, one of the things that I briefly mentioned that's coming out of this so far is the expansion of rights for tenants going through the eviction process here in Florida. So we are now, what was before, tenant gets sued, then they have to post their rent in order to file any type of defense. Crazy. Now they're able to get mediation and move forward that way. So there's a lot of positive that comes out of this. But just think about, and one of the things I want you all to think about is think about some of the positive things that come out in your community, and how can you harness those for the future post-pandemic. Next slide, please. So the next 2 slides or so, or 3 slides, are going to be pretty brief, and they're really resources for you to take home when you have this PowerPoint deck with you. So the next 3 slides are going to be local legal aid programs in your area, or local legal programs in your area, how to connect or find those, SSVF, and then also examples from other states of how these resources work together. So next slide, please. When we talk about resources, here's a list of resources, a non-exhaustive list of resources. So yeah, we can go to that next slide with that bullet point list. With the first being, I'll give a quick shout out to the American Bar Association's Commission on Homelessness and Poverty. Woo, go us. Always there to help coordinate resources. So if you're a service provider and you want to know, you're like, I don't know of any legal aid programs here, or I want to know how other people do it across the country. How do you coordinate all of your resources, whether it's veterans homelessness or youth and foster care and people children aging out of foster care? How do we coordinate those systems? reach out to the ABA's Commission on Homelessness and Poverty. Stateside Legal is another good resource. Click on that link. You can see a bunch of resources nationally and potentially in your area. LSC, Legal Services Corporation, they're the #1 funder of legal aid and legal service programs across the country. There's most likely an LSC funded organization in your area, and there may even be a non-LSC funded legal aid program in your area as well. That link will get you there. The next one is just something for your personal education. LSC recently released a Veterans Task Force report, very interesting. It kind of goes in line with the VA's challenge report, and they tapped a lot of brilliant folks to talk on that. Also, locally, the state bar's website. So the Florida bar has a website, surprisingly. Your state bar has a website. They probably have pro bono resources, and they definitely have a list of legal aid providers, I'm sure. And you can link up and start talking to people there. Local bar associations, if you Google the name of your county and the word bar association, you're probably going to come up with a list of the bar association and contact there. They usually know all of the attorneys in that area. If you cover multiple counties, you may have to do multiple counties. I don't know. The bar associations are weird. And also SSVF providers. Most of you probably know or are engaged with an SSVF provider, but next slide, please. That link right there will get you to the provider list, and we'll have a list of all the SSVF providers. So as you probably know, SSVF, it's a VA funded grant that's awarded to private nonprofits to assist very low income veteran families with preventing homelessness. And they provide case management, homelessness prevention, and other resources to help break that cycle of homelessness. And veterans and their families who are enrolled in SSVF often can get services through HUD-VASH, which is Section 8 for veterans, and access to VA healthcare, even if they're not otherwise eligible. So veterans who may have an other than honorable discharge may be able to get access to VA healthcare through homeless reintegration programs. I just got my braces tightened this morning, so I'm in a world of pain right now. I apologize. And SSVF programs may work with legal service providers as well. They may not. It's not a requirement yet. Stand by on to see where this law allowing the VA to contract directly with legal service providers ends up. We should be seeing more of that soon. But SSVF is allowed to spend dollars contracting with legal service providers to help do exactly what David and I do on a continuing basis by helping prevent veterans homelessness through legal issues. And lastly, some examples from Florida before I turn this over to David. Some examples from Florida. So we work here with the FDVA, the Florida Department of Veterans Affairs. They help coordinate services statewide. They help lobby for additional funding from the state legislature. They help get appropriation bills passed and signed into law, which has been very wonderful. The United Way for the state has a program called Mission United, started here in Broward County, but it's now in over 26 United Ways across the country. It's a coordination service. They help link all of the services, a convener of the community, if you will, link all of the services surrounding veterans in one easily manageable entry point for veterans and also for people looking to engage these resources or be part of the resources. In Florida, we have a statewide veterans helpline that's run by Bay Area Legal Services. That's the phone number. Very useful. They are right now the convener of legal for the state. Huge help. They know all the legal resources across the state. We also have 211 integration across the state as well. And also for service members, mostly the Governor's Initiative for Lawyers Assisting Warriors. That's the GI Law program started by Governor DeSantis 2.5 years ago. Helps connect active duty service members with civil pro bono when the JAG's not able to help. So Florida's got a whole host of resources that all work together, and it's wonderful. So these are just some examples. Your state probably has its own examples. And I'm going to now go ahead and pass this over to David and start reading some of the questions as well as we move on. Thank you.
Absolutely. We can go, in the interest of time, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so Similar to what James said, just a few data points here. Before the pandemic, there were an average of 3.6 million evictions annually that were filed. And as you can see, the average amount for an eviction judgment was just less than $600 in direct rental debt. Now, clearly that looks different from a place like Broward County, Miami, LA, where I'm from originally, or even sometimes in the DC, Baltimore region. But that's the average cost, right? So people are losing their house for $600, $1,200, $2,000. According to the latest analysis of the Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey, we are expecting 10.4 million, or 14% of the nation's renters, to be still behind on rent. So as we talk about sort of tenants' rights and helping our clients remain housed and not be evicted, there's still a lot of money owed to landlords. And that's something that is worthy of a conversation. But we need to make good policy decisions and know what is available in our communities and how we can work with legal aid organizations and our pro bono attorneys to make this process, to diminish this process and to get people the help that they can get. Next slide, please. So normally, the reason why I believe it's important, and again, for those who don't know, pro bono means free. I don't charge any money to provide these services. Most legal aid places, are all legal aid, it's free to clients. There may be some income requirements, like a lot of places. It doesn't take much to qualify for legal aid society. You don't always have to, submit payment information, or a W-2 or a letter saying you don't have any employment. So these are services that are free, and they do make a difference. Sometimes people are leery of free legal assistance, but think about those landlords. Most landlords are going to court without an attorney, unless they're a huge management company that may have 100 eviction notices that they're filing in court there that day. But 9 times out of 10, they're represented by a representative. That's not a lawyer. So think about a lawyer. Think about how the tenant is going to fare off better if there is an attorney present, by virtue of just that dynamic and that difference. So think about that. But tenants appearing in rent court are almost always unrepresented. They're always unfamiliar with court procedures. They're unaware of their rights if they're in a state that do have rights. Maryland is one of those states. Particularly in the city of Baltimore, there are licensing requirements, certification requirements that landlords must attain. And if they don't have those, they pretty much cannot, they can't get any type of recompense from the court. Meaning, if they don't have the license to rent, they don't have a lead certification letter, if that stuff is not up to date, then I will pretty much go in front of the judge and say, I would like to dismiss this claim, Your Honor, because this landlord does not have a valid license on file, and that tenant can just go home and not really have any issues from that. Now, that's not to, and the attorney, the landlord cannot sue for that rent. So if they owe December of 2020, January 21, February of 21, and they did not have a valid license, then that's pretty much, some money. That's money that the landlord is not going to be able to get from court. So good luck trying to get that anywhere else. Tenants that are represented are much more likely to prevail than unrepresented tenants. And the lawyers are able to navigate court. They're able to provide assurance. I talk about sort of the trauma that it takes. I like to say that I participate in this primarily in the Prince George's County area and Baltimore, because 9 times out of 10, the tenants that are in court look like me. Now, the landlords that are in court probably look like me as well. However, there's a dynamic difference here. So if I'm able to provide compassionate legal representation, then that's what I'm going to do. But we're also able to provide resources. We are able to mediate in Baltimore, in Prince George's County. We're able to, show up the day of court and provide very limited representation, but that can go a very long way by virtue of me looking at a complaint and seeing and doing a little bit of research to determine if this landlord is, if that landlord is actually licensed to rent in the city of Baltimore and in the county of Prince George's County. Next slide, please. Okay, so just want to talk about the tenant volunteer lawyer of the day court in Baltimore. It began in 2017, so it's fairly new. Attorneys have assisted about 1,400 tenants since its inception. And pretty much what people don't understand is there's multiple processes in most places to actually evict a tenant. The first thing is to go to court to actually prove, the landlord is the plaintiff in this case. So they are going to prove that rent is owed. Now, the defendant, if they are aware of any type of defenses or if there's a accounting issue, that's another thing that's fairly interesting in Maryland in particular, but especially Baltimore. But the rent court is pretty much to determine if rent is late. If a judgment is in favor of a landlord, that pretty much officially begins the eviction proceedings, meaning that, there will be about 4 days in Maryland for the tenant to appeal. Within those 4 days, the landlord can do a writ for possession, which means that they can go get a writ and then they can show that to the sheriff, and then the sheriff will be the one who evicts the tenant. But when that complaint is filed in rent court, there will be a trial date. There will be a hearing where we discuss a lot of the COVID defenses. So what's been happening over the past few months is that with the CDC order, we pretty much have been serving that on landlords, pretty much saying, okay, we have this CDC order saying that you can evict, and it's in effect until June 30th, 2021. That's why we keep saying next week's date. But we're not stopping there. We're also, again, looking at certification and licensing issues. Was service a process done? Is there a dispute of amount owed? A lot of tenants are going to say, no, I paid him for one of those months. It's just the last 2 months. So, a lot of tenants are pretty much honest about what's happening. If there are other defenses related to habitability, if it's I can never say this word, sorry, habitability issues, sorry, or if there's retaliation issues. But if there are issues related to heating, rodents, or different things like that, which I'm sure some of you have, seen, or clients have come in and say, okay, this stuff is happening. Depending on, what the law is in your jurisdiction, your state, and your county, that may be a defense at the hearing to put that into debate and to have a conversation on it and say, well, Your Honor, my client hasn't been able to pay rent because of COVID, but there's also an issue with rodents. So, even if there is a judgment that may come down for the landlord, we're going to have to put the money that's owed into rent escrow until those habitability issues are taken care of. And rent escrow is pretty much, unlike in Florida, where they have to post their rent that's due in order to fight the case. When they come to court, and if there's an issue, then they can put that rent into a separate account with the court, and the landlord won't be able to pull from that escrow account until things are fixed. They pretty much have 4 days to appeal, pay the judgment and court costs, or the landlord again may seek a warrant of restitution, is what it's called in Maryland. The one thing that I would also like to point out here is that while we've been in court, we've also been serving the landlords with the CDC order, but we've also been serving we've been helping our tenants apply for eviction prevention rental assistance. So the first CARES Act, I think there was money that was given to the states. Pretty much, I think all states are processing these applications, and it's pretty much an application between the tenant has to submit the application. They have to submit paperwork from the landlord as well, and it's paid directly to the landlord. And I'm going to continue this conversation on to the next slide. So David, if we can go to the next slide, that would be great. So this is the key sticking point here, because as I said earlier, I'm about reducing harm to the client, to the tenant, right? So the landlord is well within the rights to say, you owe me this money, I'm going to sue you for it. I want to get the place back so I can rent it to someone else, okay? However, in order to actually get money that is due, you know, 9 times out of 10, they're not going to get that from the tenant, right? So now that we have the CARES funding and all of this funding that's out here for eviction prevention and rent support, that's where we are telling, okay, tenant, this is where you should apply. This is the information that you need. Here's the email, here is a number. We're also able, as attorneys for the tenants, we're also able, I had a client, you know, who applied in March. There was an issue with the application. I didn't know, she didn't know this. I knew about it when I reached out to the email and it said the application isn't complete. Well, my thought process to the landlord is pretty much to say, okay, look, you know, the only way that you're going to get this money is if you work with the tenant to try to get rental support. You know, if there's no issues about the landlord being a bad landlord, there's no vermin or heat issues, you know, if there's no other issues, that's if the only issue is money, then we have resources for that. Just like we have unemployment, you know, all of the money that has come down, we have resources for that. There's also state and local government programs. This is always fun for me when I'm able to negotiate with the landlord and say, well, do you have a copy of your licensing certification from the city? And if they don't have it, okay, well, that's probably going to be a problem if we have to go in front of the judge. So can we, you know, dismiss this? And can you work with the tenant so that we can actually apply for rental assistance to get this working? Another issue in Maryland, if there is no proof of non-payment, so they need to keep a ledger. Landlords have to keep a ledger of how much money they were received, how much money that they're missing from non-payment. The landlord is the plaintiff, and they should have the proof, and the court requires them to have a proof. So I can easily say outside of the courtroom, say to the landlord, I actually did this last week to one landlord. In that case, pretty much was dismissed. Now, the client had all of, you know, money orders, receipts, and all of that kind of good stuff. But, you know, we were able to pretty much dismiss that case. Now, the client or the tenant did have to come to court, and there was a lot of time wasted. However, you know, we were able to get that complaint dismissed. You know, if there are any defenses, diversion programs. So, you know, again, there's a real big issues if people have lost their money due to COVID, they have gotten sick, they lost their jobs. That's horrible for the tenant. What's also horrible is the landlord not being able to pay their mortgage. You know, there's also programs out there. So I've been able to also talk to landlords about programs for them so that they can protect themselves. So, you know, I think this is where it's key, where if there are organizations or programs in your jurisdiction, then as case managers or as providers, it is imperative that you all know all of the players in the state, in the county, so that you're able to pull these resources. You know, we know that all resources are scarce, but we also have a lot of resources now because of COVID. So that should, in essence, we should figure out a way to make it a lot easier for us to make sure that we're diverting people away from court at all and figuring out ways, going upstream. And if we could go to the next slide, I'll talk about that. If we can really go upstream to figure out how can we work with landlords, or how can we create a line. So organizations, and when I say organizations, I mean service providers, I mean legal aid organizations, all of these places. Now, we all have limited capacity, but I think what COVID has also taught us is that when we work as a team within our communities, we're able to help way more people, and we're able to create more effective resources to help people. So, waiting until rent is past due is too late. Our complaint is filed. It really is too late, because, the trauma has set in. That person is already scared. They're coming to court. If they do get an eviction, proceeding on their record, that's just another issue with them finding housing in the future. I don't have to say this to all of you all. You all know this stuff. Outreach to the landlord to begin the application process for any owed rent. And I'm talking about the eviction protection rental assistance. Utilize landlord engagement techniques to mitigate issues with the tenant. So what a lot of stuff comes out in court. The landlord doesn't like me. They want me to buy the house. He's just doing this because he's retaliating against me. He knows I'm out of work. We talked about it. There's a lot of stuff that happens. And I think attorneys play a big role from the technical aspect of it, but case managers and attorneys can also work together in this capacity to really help tenants stay in their house. Partner with legal aid and other organizations for compliance issues, dealing with retaliation or issues related to if it's a livable apartment or place to stay. Collaborate with state and local agencies that can provide application support and financial support to pay back rent. I apologize for that typo. However, one of the key things too, in Maryland, there's the Homeless Persons Representation Project. So they work with the Maryland Pro-Bono. I do a lot of my volunteer work through the Maryland Pro-Bono Resource Center, but so there are about 3 or 4 agencies in tenant and rent court, talking to each other and helping tenants as much as we can. So you have really, really awesome service providers that are able to to assist. And if you don't have this in your area, like James said, reach out to your, you probably don't know that you have it. Reach out to your county or city or state state bars. They have pro bono arms. They may be able to give you a list of attorneys. One thing that we didn't list in here, law schools. Law schools have clinics as well. And in DC, Howard University, my alma mater, they have a clinic that helps people. UDC has a clinic that helps people. I'm sure a lot of law schools also have clinics where you're able to provide help to law school students in terms of experience, but also you're able to have limited representation of tenants. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the event that an eviction does happen, and please take this, I'm trying to say how I'm going to say this. Self-help evictions are pretty much illegal in almost every state. What that means is landlords have to go through the court system. They have to use, it may be, in DC, it's the, I forget what the police is called, but anyway, it may be a sheriff, it's law enforcement. They have to go to court, they have to get a judgment for the back rent. If the tenant doesn't pay up within whatever that grace amount of period in the state is, then they will get the writ for possession, or the writ for they will get a writ to get the property back. They have to take that writ to the sheriff's office, to law enforcement, and the law enforcement is the person who performs the eviction. Okay, so a landlord changing locks or any of that type of stuff, it's illegal pretty much in any state. That's not legal. The tenant has the right, in Maryland, the tenant has the right to pay the total amount due, including court costs. The good thing about what has happened because of COVID is that they, I think it may be the CDC order or the state, the governor's order, Hogan's order, but late fees are not allowable costs under the COVID emergency. So you don't have to pay that, but there may be some other court costs. I say this to some clients who come in or some tenants, you know, it may be best for them to hold any future rent payments and seek new housing. And that's for a lot of different reasons. It's because of, you know, the landlord is just ornery, don't want to get a loan, they don't want to work with you. This is a way for them to get you out. And by all means, it might just be better for you in terms of not creating a headache around that. That's a privileged statement to make. And I recognize that. But it just may be best to try to find a future place to stay. Again, try to negotiate with the landlord to leave the premises without going through the court system. You know, if you do have some money, you know, I will always say get an agreement in writing because they can always change their mind. However, you know, you can negotiate a way to leave the premises without going through the court system. That you know, if it's a good landlord and they just really want to pay their mortgage, that might be something that they're willing to do in order to prevent that person from having issues in the future or renting other properties. Last but certainly not least, keep an organized account of communication. So as case managers or providers, if you're having issues with landlords, keep calls, text messages, emails. I mean, some landlords just don't remember the stuff that they say. It's okay. You can do it this day. You can do it that day. I received a letter saying that the payment was going to be made. So that's going to be a key thing to have. Next slide, please. And I hear that you guys have some really good questions. So we're going to try to get to that. I swear to God, I'm wrapping up my portion of this, but I also wanted to include, from my perspective as an attorney, one of the key things is that we've been able to use is, does the tenant have funds to pay the back rent, right? So I think this is from I forget what website this is from. This is the National Counties and States website. It's emergency housing assistance. So the map here is what's on their website. When you click on the map, I actually clicked on North Carolina here, and that's their program for emergency housing assistance. We want to make sure, and there's plenty more, SSVF for some of the clients that you all might serve, HUD-VASH, any of our other programs that may be providing funds for prevention services or emergency housing assistance. There are resources out here. So if we can quickly get our tenants and get our clients lined up with resources, we will be able to really control how many evictions that, you know, we might see happen in the next few weeks or months. But right now is the time to do it if you do have any clients that are suffering from financial hardships due to COVID, losing a job, medical issues because of COVID. If you can tie it to COVID, tie it to COVID. That's what I will say. If you can tie it to COVID, tie it to COVID. There's resources out here, and we have to make sure that we're protecting our most vulnerable. Do I have another slide? I got down my role of preaching, so I want to keep going. Do we have any more slides? No, I think that's it. So the last thing that I will say in this part is that Maryland is one of 2 states actually that recently has passed a bill that in effect provides a right to counsel for low-income residents in eviction proceedings. So I think it's the state of Washington and the state of Maryland. So it was signed in May, and it becomes effective October 1st. So as a pro bono attorney that is an advocate and does this work just to help people, I find that very exciting. Maryland is a state that, you know, on paper has really good tenant laws. However, that's not always the case in court. And I won't talk about that anymore or any longer. I'll just keep it moving on that point. Depending on, a judge, that stuff may or may not work. But I'm really excited that Maryland is one of those states. So, if you guys are looking to see how you can make your state or rally, some of your representatives, your state members of state legislators to enact laws like that, then I highly encourage you all to do that, because we need to ensure that our low income residents have a right to counsel, and that we're providing them counsel for these proceedings. It happens very, very quickly. Many people don't know what any of this stuff means. So if we are able to have someone there to steer them through that process, I think that will make a world of difference in helping to ensure that people are not wrongfully evicted. But thank you. But I think now we are going to open it up for questions. So Jasmine is coming back. There she is.
Hi. All right, so I'm trying to catch up. I'm taking my own notes, I'm writing my own questions and going through these questions from the audience. So just before we jump into discussing the poll that we started with and kind of relating that to your presentations and then some of the comments that came through, we had a couple of state employees, which I guess was a missed field in our poll. So state employees, if your state has like a Department of Veterans Affairs in addition to the I guess federal programs maybe, then employees that fall under that category. But let's see, David, I'm not sure, are you able to put the results of the poll up? If not, I can kind of go through it. So in the very beginning, we asked who is in attendance today. So large majority are providers, case managers, outreach workers. And then let's see, the next most populous, federal employees. Okay. All right, so that makes sense, and that also explains some of the questions that we have. So a lot of the questions, I'll be honest, are about finding resources for eviction prevention, dealing with some of the resources kind of like dwindling out as we move away from, I guess, the initial impact of COVID and into recovery. So first question I did see, or comment I saw, is that people are having a hard time finding resources. So I know you guys both gave some sites, but maybe like a Google like keyword searches, or how do people even start looking for resources if their usual lineup like SSVF isn't have funding, their county maybe doesn't have funding, like how do people look for resources, additional resources?
I would like to answer a portion of that, and I'll start with what I think needs to happen from an advocate's point of view, right? We have to make the business case to keep funding these type of programs, right? So I think that with the influx of COVID funding that's coming into play, I think organizations definitely need to work with funders to see, okay, how many households are we helping to prevent from eviction? How many children are we doing? Like, however we can break down the data to show that we are helping this many people, I think that's important. So we have to make the business case to continue the funding in the future. Keyword searches. One of the key things, NCHB, NLIHC, low income, any other low income type of organizations are where I think we're going to be able to find the money. I will also just type in eviction prevention. That's the easy one there. And most times everything is geotagged at this point anyway. So no matter where you are in the country, if you type that in, it's probably going to come up with, like for me, it was Maryland or it was Virginia, DC. You're going to find places. So I think, and I think cultivating those relationships of those programs, seeing who the funders are. James listed some of the ones from his section of the slides. That's how we're going to continue this funding, because it's sorely needed. And I'm happy we didn't really talk about sort of the infighting between, like, helping the most vulnerable homeless individuals and then funding prevention, because I think each side has valid points, but I think depending on program models and what's being provided to families and individuals, that's how we want to just continue this. So we have to make the business case for it. James?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you, David. I think you nailed it on, hit the nail on the head with, there's a lot of, I think the first thing is obviously, if you have all those resources normally integrated into your community, reach out to them as well. Even if they're like, oh no, you talk to a fellow case manager, like, oh no, I don't know anyone. Talk to another case manager. Maybe somebody else at their organization does know, and maybe there's just a lack of continuity going on with one of the providers. Most of these organizations that you are already working with know of at least some of the other resources in the community. Follow that chain to investigate, and the more people you connect with, the more exposure you get to their network as well. So it's super helpful. Just be a good person, and it helps. It helps being nice.
Yeah, and I'm going to address the capacity issue, because I think people are like, you want it easy, you want it in your face, right? We have a lot of work to do with very little resources. This is where interns and colleges and all of this stuff plays. And so, be creative. And I know that sometimes when you are in the thick of doing your work, it's hard to put on that creativity hat. But be creative. If there's a need, then I think we have a responsibility to try to figure out how can we solve that need.
Good stuff. Okay. All right. So I think I have a question that's specific to Florida. Let me see. Yes, I have an SSVF case manager, Broward County. They're wondering if you have a veteran who has attended mediation for an eviction, does this mean that the eviction will be listed on their credit history?
So the eviction should only be listed on their credit history if they have a final judgment of the eviction. However, one of the things that is an issue in Florida, and there's been some recent legislation to try to address this, is that on the public record search on the docket, any filed eviction remains there regardless of whether it's finalized or not. So it could be landlord files eviction, tenant already paid the money, in between the time of landlord filing and that actually reaching the docket. That's still going to remain on the docket. There's not a whole lot that can be done at this time. There is legislation that didn't make it to committees, but had some traction. It was the first year of introduction, so it's common that this happens, but had some traction. The legislation was to remove from the public record, from the docket, these evictions under several circumstances, and one of the circumstances was even after it was finalized and a period of time has elapsed. So at this point, it should not impact it shouldn't be on the credit report because there's no final judgment, but it will likely remain on the, not likely, it is going to remain on the docket if it had already been filed, though it will just show up as a case that was dismissed and not finalized.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. I did have a comment from the audience. It looks like HVRP programs might have some additional funding for this type of work. So in addition to all of the other resources, check your local HVRP programs. So I have a question. Is there something that can be done for people that have multiple evictions? Should they work through the same sort of process? And how will this work against individuals with multiple evictions that are going to be or are going to be evicted again after the moratorium's end? Like, how might this work against them in court? How do you deal with people that this is not their first eviction, and you're trying to advocate for them, I guess?
Yeah, one of the things as attorneys, I'm sure we say this a lot, everything is on a case-by-case basis. So there might be an individual who had 10 evictions in the past 10 years, or an individual who had 10 evictions over the past 30 years. These things, may have to approach these differently. But yeah, it's definitely an issue that we're well aware of, is people that just kind of get stuck in this secular system of evictions where they get services, they're able to sustain, and then they fall right back into being evicted again. One of the things that and on the veteran space is, we're fortunate to at least have these resources conceptually available, is the ability to address the other needs as well. What is the underlying need? Instead of addressing the downstream issue every time, well, what is causing these issues? Is it a lack of cash flow? Is it a lack of employability? Is it a lack of some sort of community structure? What is it that this individual or this family needs in order to break this cycle? I think that is really where we, as the royal we, all of us here can step in and do something. We're all very busy, and sometimes we operate like this with our blinders on, only looking at the issue in front of us. But if we can really take a second to take a step back, and especially on these individuals who are just the repeat offenders, if you will, the people you always see stuck in the system, we can really take a step back and see what are the issues. Why does this person keep returning to us? Yeah. What can we do? I think that's the best advice I have for you on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would say too, this is why it's important if they're in terms of, who's on the COC board, or, case conferencing between communities, and bringing in, if there's a particular client who just has that type of history and continues to have it, then I would go out on a limb to say, especially if they're being served by any of our programs, whether it be rapid housing or anything else, then that might not be the best, that might not be the best program for them. So I think looking at and figuring out a way to have that communications across organizations is important. And I think this is why it's important for providers to have relationships with legal aid places so that they can have conversations, not talk about anything too legal or too confidential, but to have those conversations in terms of why are we keep seeing this person come into court and they're being represented by us all the time. How can we make sure that they're not coming back? Is there something happening? Is there figure out what that core issue is, and then hopefully we can make sure that they're not back here in a year and 2 years. But James did a good job of answering it.
Great. Okay. And then I did have some feedback from the audience just about looking for second chance housing in these scenarios where landlords are openly communicating that they're willing to work with people who have a history of evictions. So yeah, I encourage people to start with that if you're having trouble finding housing for these type of clients. So we had a couple of questions about the point of intervention. So you touched on it, David. I think when we have programs, for example, that require like a notice, and they need that before they can even touch the person. And once you have the notice, it might be too late to kind of step in and intervene. So I guess to simplify it all, is there a point that is ideal for intervention if you're preventing eviction?
I'm happy that this question was brought up. So I think that it behooves us as a part of, as service providers, and I can say this because I've worked in homeless services before, but the reality is it's figuring out, like having a door open for people to come to you if they have an issue, right? So if they're saying, and hopefully that they communicate this, right? Sometimes people are just too prideful or whatever the case may be, and they might not have, they might not have the energy or the ability to bring it up to people who can possibly help them. But it's never too late if they are still in possession of the property. And what I mean by that is that, yes, as James stated earlier, it's the same thing in Maryland. And I had a client who was really scared. They can look up this case and see that I've gone to eviction court, and that's probably going to hurt me if I try to find somewhere else to stay. Very, very, very important thing to think about. That's very important. But however, I think, getting a letter from a landlord or getting a letter from an attorney or a case manager saying, this person did have issues paying their rent, but they were not evicted because they took the steps necessary to get rental assistance. So it's never late. It's never late if they haven't been evicted. If they're still in their apartment, then we want to try to process the payment as quickly as possible. But you want to know how long If they just got notice saying I got to go to court in 3 weeks, jump on it. If they are in court already and they're calling you, I just got a judgment against me. They have in Maryland, it's 4 days, or by the time that they pay, and in some cases they can actually go take the payment, down to the sheriff's office and say I have it. So you just want to figure out what is the law in your work with legal aid, work with an attorney in your area, and figure out when is the best time to help out that client. Now, again, I will also say this because I believe in making sure that people have choice in what they're doing. If it's a bad situation, if the landlord is a scumbag, it may not be the best to put them there. So you might not want to put all those resources to stay there. We might need to figure out resources for later, and we can develop a plan for that, right? We can, as a case manager and as an attorney, we can develop a plan for that. We can help our clients, get off of their feet, and make sure that they can make the transition to where they need to go. I'll stop there.
One thing I want to add to that is, well, as I just start talking, I lose my train of thought completely, obviously. But one of the things that comes up a lot, and it doesn't just happen in the veteran space, but happens all over, is when people think they have legal problems, they're usually thinking they're getting arrested, or they need to get a divorce, or they're getting evicted. Those are things where, okay, I need an attorney, I have a legal problem. What they don't think is like, I'm falling behind on my rent, but yeah, I'll figure it out. That's a me problem. Falling behind on my bills and I need to catch up my credit card. That's people think that's a me problem, and it's not something that an attorney can help with. But in fact, attorneys have a lot of tools in their tool belt to help address these things proactively. It's hard for clients to identify that, oh, maybe I should talk to legal. So if you're talking with clients who have financial issues, if they're like, oh, well, yeah, money's tight, refer them to a legal services agency who can help. Maybe they have a consumer law unit there that can help them identify how they can resolve some of these issues to alleviate cash flow or increase cash flow by additional benefits or whatever it might be. But again, that holistic approach, being proactive, getting that issue addressed early is very helpful.
That's a good point. I think any of those creditors, especially credit card companies, it's attorney to attorney, and we already know that business is pennies on a dollar for a debt that has gone bad. So if we can figure out any way that we can give, the client says, I got $100. All right, well, I'm going to tell them we're going to pay 25, and then we're going to pay 25 over 4 months, so that's how but bringing an attorney in for that initial conversation to figure out how can we help the tenant or the client holistically is important. One other aspect that I just thought of just here, if there's a legal aid society that you can't work with, or you may be able to solicit other help from attorneys. There may be a barrier to attorneys helping if there is a need for malpractice insurance. I don't know all of the funding streams and what can pay for what, but there may be ways for you to still partner with a legal aid society, bring in the pro bono attorney, get them training through the legal aid society, and then figure out a way to have an MOU or something to where, malpractice insurance is taken care of. So there's numerous opportunities to work with legal aid societies to figure out how can we make sure that our clients for this particular program is getting the services that they need. Because as we all know, it's not just about eviction. It's about, entitlement benefits or benefits, for families, whatever the case may be. And then it's also, credit and other debt issues that are happening. So we need to think about the holistic approach and how we can provide better services to people.
All right, we'll do this final question and then I'll turn it over to you guys to wrap it up. Any final comments or thoughts? I have a attendee who's wondering about eviction expungement and if there are services like this and whether, I guess you probably know for your state, but where can people look for those type of resources?
I'll just jump in here for a second. See my previous comment from the earlier question. Florida does not have eviction expungement. Expungements in general are a criminal proceeding. Well, they're civil, but it's a criminal proceeding where it's to remove certain information or records from a criminal file. So there are some states that have sealing and expungement of those types of civil eviction records, but Florida does not have those. But if your state does, and you know how they got there, let me know, because we want to do that in Florida, obviously.
Absolutely. I would say too, for Maryland, I don't believe that's the case. I don't want to speak as confidently as James did for Florida, but similarly, expungements pretty much for criminal cases, criminal records. Yep.
All right.
But, I think my final comment on that is, let's really start thinking about talking with clients. On our case, even if they're in a certain program where we only, case management is not as extensive, check-ins, how they're, I'm pretty sure some places may be asking questions, how are you paying your bills, how are things happening, anything coming up. The moment you realize that may be an issue, try to get someone to step in then and there so that we can free up resources. It's one of those things, when we have a problem, people don't like to go to the doctor. They want to wait. I'm going to take care of it. Let's diagnose the issue and let's treat it now so we don't have these issues later. But for those that we do have issues later, these are the type of questions that you need to ask. Do a little research, share this information so that we can be better advocates and do our jobs. I think that's the best way about going about doing this.
Gotcha. All right. Well, you guys, that was great information. I thought that was a great session. Thank you guys both for your presentations, and thank you guys in the audience for being engaged and attending. If you guys have any final comments, I'll let you go ahead and add them here. But if not, we'll see you guys in our later sessions today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, you guys. Thank y'all. We'll see you later today.